Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be invited to Brisbane to be a part of this conference and to meet people involved in some work that I've been admiring from afar. And I think most importantly, to really get a flavor of something that seems to be much more of an organized movement in the area of youth mental health, something that previously is often a number of separated projects and research studies and so on. So this has been excellent. And it's also nice as an academic to be asked to give a slightly different form of talk, let you know a bit about me and my path in this work, some of which you already know is in my ability to develop really concise titles for talks. So I'm going to get started here. First off with acknowledgement, and I think this is more than acknowledgements, this is really making a point, is that these are just some of my more recent collaborators. Work in this space with people experiencing complex forms of adversity is really the work of many and bringing in many different perspectives. It's a work of partnership with many different organizations and working with government and various funders. So it's a collaborative effort as I've come to understand it over the years. And the story I'm going to tell here is basically in all aspects of my life, the story of my life is starting out pretty clear about something, then getting quite confused, and then finding a way out the other side slightly less confused, but still a little confused. So in terms of my career, I started out in undergrad doing brainstem electrophysiology, which was really kind of interesting stuff, pairing up oscilloscopes and working out of a lab and that kind of thing. At the same time, just as a bit of a hobby, I was volunteering at homeless shelters and crisis lines, aka I had no idea what I was doing. But I got into clinical graduate school at Windsor, and I met this guy, Michael Kroll, who became a mentor and who was masochist enough to not only be a psychologist, but his second PhD in anthropology. And he proposed a radical idea. At the time, I was interested in non-suicidal self-harm, and we got talking about homeless youth populations. I've had contact with over the years a fair bit at that stage. And he said, research can be going out with a tape recorder, a bit like that one, and asking them what's going on, what's happening in your life, and what's happening with suicide. And this is from somebody that came from kind of bench science. This is mind-blowing, the notion that you could wander the streets, have conversations with people, and this could be research. So I kitted myself up with mittfuls of McDonald's dollars and hit the streets, and that was kind of, this been the start of my research career. Initially qualitative, becoming mixed methods, but I spent time in New York City and Toronto and Vancouver talking with, over the years, hundreds of young people on a range of different topics and working out of organizations too, not just the streets, but places like Street Outreach Services in Toronto, which is a service for sex-trafficked young people, and gave out a lot of McDonald's dollars. So when things seemed fairly clear, I think things were a little clearer when I was just getting started. I spent many conversations with young people about suicide, young people who are experiencing homelessness, and learned about and wrote about rates of suicidality, attempt rates, about a third amongst homeless youth generally. If you get into sex-trafficked young people, it's more like 2/3 to 3/4. Understanding the experiences that young people went through that led to suicidality, and hearing some really terrible stories. And this was very difficult as a young researcher at the time, is to try and wrap my head around what was happening in the lives of the young people I was speaking with. And when you hang around agencies and spend time on the streets, you do get to know people beyond just surveys. And so it really was, it was a challenge to kind of get into this. And understanding suicide as an experience of being trapped, of having been through various traumatic circumstances of often quite high intensity, and as I got deeper and deeper into these narratives and understanding the lives of these young folks, is seeing the systemic aspects of challenge, not just individual. I went from there into speaking with many young people about resilience and survival skills necessary on the streets, kind of making meaning, really, as things got further, understanding that young people who were more street entrenched and into street cultures actually survived a little better in the short term in street context, but were harder to reach with providers to exit homelessness. Young people who were not acclimatizing to street contexts were in more short-term challenge and more at risk of victimization, but in the longer term were more easy to reach by providers. So this is the space I was in, and as I was having these conversations, one of the more quantitative studies I did, I had a blank page at the end of a long survey. You just can't have a blank page, right? You're giving out hundreds of these things. So I wrote at the top at the last second, write or draw whatever you want people to see, and collected many pieces of art, poems and messages. And this picture, I think, captures a lot of what this is about, way more than I can say in a linear way of speaking or showing statistics and so on. But this was given to me by a gang-affiliated Latina young woman in New York City, and this captured her experience. She corrected me when I was speaking with her. I was telling them I'm the guy doing research on homelessness, and she says, "Who are you calling me homeless? I am houseless," and that was a point of education. But she gave me this piece of art, and this is her in the middle, detached from the world. The spikes are her very tough demeanor, which help her survive. Didn't know her father, he's just a broken condom to her, and the thorny connection, you can make it out to her mom with sex trade involved and who got her into the sex trade. And the world is the jagged edge. That's a world that she can't reach that seems harsh in every respect. So I moved on from there on asylum clinical psychologist. So I was trying to do clinical work, and I can tell you that one-on-one psychotherapy in highly averse sort of drop-in contexts just doesn't work. It wasn't working at all, and it really challenged my understanding of how to work with people in very marginalized circumstances. Susan Miner ran Street Outreach Services at the time, and she's a great lady, a mentor in many ways. She said to myself and a social worker at the time, "Sean, Reka, build a group that doesn't suck." That was the instruction, go. So we got together and realized that in this space, groups roundly fail. You get together, you've got an addictions focus group or motion regulation group. This don't work. So what we did, you might recognize this, I'm dating myself a bit, but whose line is it anyways? We did skits, we did art, we built sandcastles on the beach, and this got young people out who are sex trade involved and experiencing homelessness in a way the groups didn't in the past. And what we found was it was around the side. After the group, a young woman would come up and talk about being victimized by her partner or an addictions issue, and there we'd work in some DBT and some advocacy and the pieces around. So it was an education in how traditional psychology didn't work and how something different was needed. So you can kind of get the theme here is here I'm starting to get a little confused about what to do. Is moving from describing, seeing the complexity, and getting confused about how do you actually work in this space in an effective way. And fast forward a little bit, some years later, still grappling with how to work with really highly marginalized people and intervene. I read this book. It's really about Ashoka, an organization that had an approach that I really liked. It was an introduction to the frame of social entrepreneurship and this idea that rather than outsiders coming in with a lot of ideas about what might work, in the frame of low and middle income countries, it's the Land Rovers roll in, do something, and then leave, and things often fall back to where they were before, is you find local innovators, you support them and help them to make more of a difference. And that resonated in the homeless youth frame in particular, because there are often approaches, people, organizations that are doing some really cool things, but they kind of come and go. The organization ends, the grant ends, the person moves on, and these things just fade into the distance. And so the idea that you could kind of go out, capture something, start to generate evidence, and build from the ground up really appealed to me. And so I took a deep dive in there, got some funding to do some research in the area. One of the things I did was try and do a survey or a scan of literature on what's happening, what is social entrepreneurship, what's it about, and developed a really long list of characteristics of social entrepreneurs, the kinds of activities they engaged in, the structures that support them, and it's a long, horrible table I'm not going to torture you with, but really what I was reading there in this incredibly long list is people didn't really know. It was whenever you get a super long list, it means that people aren't sure. And I entered this space even further, and there's lots of talk about disruptive innovators and incubators, and at some point I didn't know what the heck anyone was talking about, including myself. So nonetheless, forged forward, and I had the privilege of this is where I really wanted to trade jobs with my postdocs. They could hang around my office and write grants and run projects. I really wanted their job, which was touring the world, meeting with Ashoka fellows working in mental health and addictions, to try and capture and understand, in a range of contexts, how did they do it in a very averse, in many ways, context. How do they tackle a major mental health challenge, a systemic challenge, build an organization and an intervention that works and is viable over time. It's a tremendous challenge, and could we capture that and share it with other people who could benefit from some of that wisdom? And you can certainly find a place you can read about it there and a few other spots, the details. But what the takeaway for me was things started to cohere a little bit, really beginning to understand the systemic nature of mental health challenges in low-income countries, but as well how that applies to youth homelessness. And when looking at things in a systems way, could really see how people who excelled in this area found points of leverage. You could be doing 100 different things, but you'll never get the money to do it, nor maybe should you do it. You find the spots and points of leverage where investment gets the biggest bang for the buck, the biggest impact. As well, along with an intervention, and it's often complex interventions that work, you need to create space for the work. That involves political engagement, engaging the public, engaging communities in effective ways so people get on board. And so this was really helpful to begin to wrap my head around something that was making sense and was coherent. And at the same time, I was doing a study that was one of the most depressing studies I've ever been involved in, is looking at the question of what happens to formerly homeless young people after they've left homelessness. So we spent a year meeting with about 50 young people in 2 sites in Canada, 4 times in the year, and what we saw was a really depressing path for the vast majority. A quarter were street homeless within that year. The majority of the remainder really weren't kind of living the dream. They weren't making gains in education, employment, were really stagnating in a range of contexts and socially isolated and struggling with mental illness. Maybe on one hand, you could count the number of people who are living the path that we all hope happens when someone gets housing. And at the end of it all, I was getting more and more tired of producing sort of dry reports that seldom get read, is thought, let's make a comic book. I'm also really a nervous person, and I can never really make sense of the ledgers, the accounts on these grants. They're incredibly complicated for some reason, so I was ended up with a few thousand extra bucks. So we got an artist together with 3 of our participants, and they created this comic that kind of told the story of a protagonist struggling to find his way out of homelessness. And we had a knowledge exchange event, as one does after this sort of work. A lot of the partners together, and really what came of that was we began to get a feel of the partners in Toronto primarily, the organizations that really were interested in this space, interested in engaging. And the study also, as much as it was a sad year, we really learned a lot about what young people wanted and needed. What they wanted was brass tack support on navigating housing, justice, employment, education. That needed to be there. They didn't want to come back to shelter spaces for that because they'd moved on and those spaces were often triggering. They wanted peer support that wasn't terrible. Many had had experiences with peer support that didn't make sense, that didn't hold together. But they did want that wisdom as part of their path. And they needed mental health support. Not all, but a majority, and some needed quite intensive mental health supports. So at the KT event, we had art, music, and we had share the comic book. And the KT events, most don't work as much as we'd like to think they do work. But nonetheless, something happened that was gobsmacking at the time. Is this man, Alex Bazina, he's the Deputy Minister of Children and Youth Services in Ontario at the time. He came up at the end of this and says, I want to talk to you about what you're doing here and discuss how we can build an approach that we can look at implementing in Ontario. And I can tell you, after years and years of trying to get any policymaker to pay some attention to this, to have a senior one come up and say, how can I help? You could have knocked me over with a feather. So nonetheless, he got us going. And that began something called the Housing Outreach Project Collaboration. We had a name that we'd come up with earlier that our youth corrected us on. It was kind of terrible. So they came up with HOPC, and basically it was the idea of an intervention that's an intensive team-based intervention that's not anchored to any one organization, that floats in a city, that incorporates skillful outreach-based case management, like I mentioned, peer support integrated within the team, and had a number of partners coming together along with mental health support. So really this team-based, and as well, it wasn't a model that they had to do all the things. They could pick and choose what they needed at a given time, and really applying in that first year of having found housing. And so we piloted it in Toronto, and something remarkable happened is at the end of the 6 months of doing the intervention, we hadn't really lost many folks. Only about 3 out of 31. We'd lost track of. The rest stayed engaged. We saw good outcomes. Now, it wasn't a trial, but we saw good outcomes nonetheless. People liked it. We were really coming together as a team, and it worked well. So the outcomes are pretty good. Moved on from there to an RCT, a randomized trial in Toronto, comparing HOPC, as I just described it, against just case management on its own. That's on my desk, about to get off to a journal. But basically what we showed was 2 to 3 times better gains in housing, education, and employment and mental health stability as compared to case management alone. It's underpowered, so we need to work on a larger scale trial, but the outcomes are promising. Again, we heard about positive impacts. We engaged Indigenous partners, and a version of HOPC was piloted in Thunder Bay by an Indigenous organization for Indigenous youth. That went pretty well. And the next step is kind of going to scale. And so we published a number of papers on outcomes, developing pieces. We were working on the knowledge exchange piece, got a logo, we're getting some guidelines developed, and that's us. Just kidding. No, I'm not done yet, I'm just kidding. That wouldn't be very honest of me, would it? Okay, so we should talk about screwing things up. So problems, mistakes, and some fumbling around. I'd be really making up a fib if I was to say we really had all this sorted out in the early days, and we're still working at this. So at the beginning, we were told by young people they wanted peer support that was different. Sure, let's do that. We didn't really know how to do that. We got young people at the table, fulsome members of our team, and really it took many months for the young folks who'd experienced homelessness to really, for us to create the right space as well for them to have this unusual proposition that they are full team members, that they have a space at the table and are driving the agenda, driving the direction, involved in research, involved in everything we're doing as much as everyone else. But we didn't know how to do that initially, and it took quite a bit of work. How to get the team running well. We had a very diverse group of case managers, of social work, child and youth backgrounds, a psychologist, youth, and trying to get all of that speaking to each other in a really effective way. It really took some time to figure out that process. Keeping the partnerships on course. These were organizations that had a set way of doing things, been doing things a certain way for many years. To come together and do things for some organizations quite differently, we had to repeatedly correct the course, remind people about what our mission is, and come back to what we're trying to do. And this is messy science. And I can say some of the researchers in the room might resonate with this. Thank God for the rise of pragmatic trials, because this is a mess in terms of an RCT. You've got diverse youth approaching an intervention with many components. They don't have to do it all. And just trying to track this over time, from a trials perspective, is incredibly difficult and challenging. So some things that we may have gotten a little bit more right than wrong. One thing that, and it's something I don't think's talked about probably enough, I might be wrong about that, but is really working hard on the relationships. This is difficult work. We were engaging young people who were having really profound struggles, and we're trying to come together with this new approach and as a team and get to know each other. We needed to play as a team, get together, play ping pong, go bowling. We needed to hang out. We needed to get to know each other and really work on the relationships and not just be caught up as I and others can be is in the logistics of running a study and running this grant and doing all that kind of stuff, but really kind of working on the relationships, because that all fed out in turn to the relationships that as providers people were giving or sort of engaging with the participants of the project. Engaging the larger field. I think it's something that we've been really focusing on is the Housing First for Youth movement in Canada, and others working in this space. Joanna Henderson, a colleague many of you know, is trying to, how do we fit this approach, this specific approach, into the larger effort? And it's not just about homeless youth, it's about youth, marginalized youth in general, of whom homeless youth are some. Housing is needed, other supports are needed, and how do we fit in with that larger national effort? Having an Indigenous partnership, and then one that's actually a real partnership. Our Indigenous partners, they run the show in Thunder Bay. We collaborate and we spend time there. They spend time with us. And that's really been a journey of mutual learning, and it's really worked so well. And it's really been driven by this true collaboration and true Indigenous leadership. And as well, following the lead of the young people involved. I touched on that a second ago, but really, we had some ideas about drop-ins and different things that finally, after about a year or so, our youth leaders said, yeah, it's not working. We don't want to do that. It's not useful. We want to get together. We want to produce tangible projects and outcomes. We want something to put on a resume. We want to earn a bit of money. We want to learn some stuff. So they essentially created, along with sort of, we had sort of social events and that sort of thing happening. I was able to kind of keep up my skills of, I don't know if some of you might have this as, when you don't have much of a budget for social things, is cold calling businesses and organizations and asking them for stuff for free. So we got them into the Toronto International Film Festival, and a bunch of our youth hung out just behind Lady Gaga at a documentary about her, and so lots of cool stuff stuff happening there. One-on-one peer support and managing the boundaries of that was a whole thing to work on. But also these micro-participatory action projects. So our youth produced a By Youth for Youth guide for exiting homelessness called the My Guide that we sent all over the place. They wanted hard copies of it, contrary to the idea that young people really want everything digital. They wanted hard copies, and that's morphed into a project that's happening in Thunder Bay now, a By Youth for Youth project, and one in Managua, Nicaragua. And we're going to keep that rolling because it was just such a good idea. But into the home stretch here, this isn't a story with a nice ending or a clear ending at this stage. I'm still in a process of learning, and this is why this conference has been so great, is to just really see how these large-scale collaborative efforts get a lot done in this space. But it's really been a journey about thinking more and more about systems and leverage and how to design approaches that do have leverage. And particularly at points of transition. I think there's a lot of action there. Thinking about who to engage, the process of engagement, and really how power manifests itself throughout, and really patience, as this is definitely more of a marathon than a sprint, so, as they say. So that's it. I'll finish up. This is truly the end. Finish up with a poem. I showed a picture of Astor Square Park in New York City. The young guy I spent some time hanging out with there wrote this poem that I think is perhaps a nice way of finishing. Thanks very much.